To many people, the subject of American slavery evokes thoughts of antebellum Southern plantations. However, throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, slavery remains widespread throughout the North. Among the earliest slaves are Native Americans, who are captured in various conflicts and wars. In the region that would become New Jersey, the Native Americans are called the Lenape. This group, along with other Indian tribes, develop a reputation for being unruly slaves. As a result, some are shipped out to large plantations in the West Indies. Many Lenape simply die off, as they have no immunity to European diseases. Colonists unwittingly exposed both free and enslaved Indians to smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, cholera, and the plague, which caused entire tribes to vanish. As a result of all this, Lenape slavery is not considered practical. New Jersey, along with Pennsylvania and New York, is part of the Dutch colony called New Netherland. The Dutch make Manhattan their main base of operation. During 1626, the first enslaved Africans arrive in New Netherland to work for the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company is anxious to develop its resources in their colony and ships African slaves to meet the demand for hard labor, with some slaves being introduced into New Jersey. By the time of the English takeover, 1 out of every 8 white New Netherland residents owned slaves. During 1664, the British seized New Netherland from the Dutch. Proprietors purchased land from Lord John Berkeley and from the estate of Sir George Carteret. The colonies of East and West Jersey are formed, with the government under the control of the proprietors. Under the proprietary regime, black enslavement is encouraged. The concessions and agreement law offer additional acres of land for each slave imported. Such inducements spawn a rapid increase in the slave labor force, and by 1680, slavery is well established in East Jersey. For decades, the British slave trade is controlled by the Royal African Company. However, in 1689, the British government opens up the slave trade to all English merchants, which dramatically increases the number of ships that can now carry enslaved people. During 1702, the proprietors surrender control of East and West Jersey to the Royal Crown, that is, Queen Anne of England. Queen Anne urges Royal Governor Lord Cornbury to promote the importation of slaves. The triangle trade is born. Molasses from the Caribbean is shipped to New England. The molasses is fermented into rum. Both the rum, along with some of the monetary profits, are loaded in New England ships bound for Africa, where black slaves are purchased. The slaves are packed into the New England ships, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and sold in the Caribbean. This process is continuous. Molasses to rum to slaves. Situated at the junction of the Arthur Kill and Raritan River is the city of Perth Amboy. This colonial capital is easily accessible via the Atlantic Ocean to the Raritan Bay. From the islands of Barbados and Montserrat, the first black slaves are imported into this colonial capital city. And as a center of government, commerce, and shipping, Perth Amboy becomes a slave port. The 18th century city dock is located on the site of the present-day ferry slip. Here, enslaved Africans disembark slave ships. The larger ships dock in the Raritan Bay and send longboats to bring their human cargo to the city dock. The slaves are forced up Smith Street to the corner of Water Street. Barracks have been built near this intersection in order to accommodate the slave trade. The colonies of New York and Pennsylvania collect tariffs on Africans imported for slavery. However, for a period of 48 years, the New Jersey colony does not charge. Between 1721 and 1769, New Jersey allows duty-free importation of enslaved people. In order to maximize profits, slave ships select Perth Amboy as a port of entry, while New York City and Philadelphia are bypassed. From 1726 to 1790, New Jersey's black population grows 500%. And this involuntary workforce makes a vital contribution to the colony's economic development. The date is July 5th, 1750, and the location is Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Mr. and Mrs. Obadiah Ayres are tavern owners, known for their fine fare and accommodations. They are also slave owners. Tavern slaves do much of the physical labor as well as serve patrons. Mrs. Ayres scolds one of her male slaves over some trifle. After this, Mrs. Ayres sits down near the window. A round rifle ball blasts through the glass, promptly killing Mrs. Ayres. The man holding the rifle is the same man Mrs. Ayres recently reprimanded. Realizing that his punishment will be death, the murderer devises a scheme. He knows that a newly imported young slave wishes to run away, so he gives the rifle to this boy, telling him to run into the woods and shoot at anyone that he encounters. His thought is that the boy will be blamed for the murder of Mrs. Ayres. And, of course, with some urging, the young man takes the gun and races away. Colonial flintlock guns have a tendency to misfire, and that's exactly what happens. The young slave is captured and confesses what he knows. The murderer is apprehended, with both slaves being placed in jail. A trial is held in Perth Amboy City Hall, then known as the courthouse. A very special sentence of death is pronounced. Although the young man has no hand in Mrs. Ayres' murder, he is given the exact same verdict as the killer. Unfair according to modern-day standards. However, harsh judgments for slave offenses are commonplace during colonial days. Before the sentence is carried out, it is tradition that the condemned be taken to St. Peter's Church, where they can pray and make their peace with God. From there, the two slaves are taken to a ravine on the north side of Perth Amboy, the area past present-day Washington Street, known in colonial days as Negro Gully. All of Perth Amboy's slaves are summoned from their homes and made to gather around in a circle with the two prisoners in the middle. Both condemned slaves are tied to large stakes anchored deep in the subsoil. Firewood is placed around them, and torches start the execution. Both men are burnt alive, with the slave population witnessing it all. Almost every home in colonial Perth Amboy has slaves. Even the respected Johnston clan owned enslaved people. Catherine Van Cortlandt Johnston runs the family household. Her spouse, Andrew Johnston, is the Speaker of the New Jersey Assembly, Mayor of Perth Amboy, Treasurer of the Colony, and most importantly, President of the East Jersey Board of Proprietors. While Andrew and Catherine are well liked, their relative, John Johnston, is commonly acknowledged at the time as one of the best men in the colony. In an earlier era, John Johnston holds many titles, including a court judgeship. As a judge, Johnston sentences murderers to death. For most, it is a typical hanging. But here, a slave named Caesar receives a much more unusual sentence, perhaps as a warning to other slaves.
Caesar, thou art found guilty by the country of those horrid crimes that are laid to thy charge. Therefore the court doth judge that thou, the said Caesar, shall return to the place from whence thou camest, and from thence to the place of execution, when thy right hand shall be cut off and burned before thine eyes. Then thou shalt be hanged up by the neck till thou art dead, dead, dead. Then thy body shall be cut down and burned to ashes in a fire. And so the Lord have mercy on thy soul, Caesar. John Johnston, Presiding Justice of the Monmouth Court of Sessions, September 23, 1694.
While deplorable, owning slaves is an accepted way of life in the British colonies. During the mid-18th century, it is not thought of as odd or unusual. Here, another well-respected New Jersey colonist posted an advertisement in a colonial newspaper. £5 reward. Run away from the subscriber, sometime in October 1762, a mulatto woman named Violet, about 30 years of age, of middle stature, was born at Princeton in the province of New Jersey, very active and pretends to be a free woman. She has since been seen in company with one James Locke, somewhere upon the Susquehanna, and by information was afterward, in the year 1764, taken up and committed to the jail of Frederickstown in Maryland, on suspicion of her being runaway, from whence she is said to have made her escape. She then acknowledged that she had belonged to the subscriber, but being imposed upon by being sold a slave for life, runaway, which is only an invention of hers, for she was born a slave. Philip Carney, Perth Amboy in New Jersey, March 16, 1766. Providing a military presence since 1758, the Perth Amboy British Barracks contains a regiment of English troops. Various regiments are stationed within the barracks, even during peacetime. British grenadiers are seen across this colonial capital city as they parade down High Street and conduct training maneuvers from the barracks to Sandy Point on the Raritan River. There will be no slave uprisings in the shadow of this army. Many of the founding fathers owned slaves. This enslaved servant may be William Lee. Lee is General George Washington's personal valet throughout the American Revolution. Following Washington into battle is a required task for Lee, as Lee is entrusted with Washington's telescope, along with the general's secret military correspondence. During the heat of battle, Lee is no more than an arm's length away from Washington. Upon Washington's death, he frees William Lee and requires that Martha Washington frees remaining slaves upon her demise. Martha frees over 120 slaves within her lifetime. Over 5,000 black men served in Washington's army during the American Revolution. In 1775, Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore offers freedom to any slave willing to serve in the British Army. Enslaved blacks fought on both sides during the war, with the majority of free blacks supporting American patriots. Royal Governor Lewis Morris is one of the largest slave owners in the province, and the gentry of that day and time are no different. Wealthy businessman Aaron Schuyler acquires 200 black slaves to work his mines. While digging deep into the bedrock, flooding occurs, entombing enslaved miners. Proprietor David Lyle has both enslaved blacks and enslaved Native Americans working his 300-acre plantation in Middletown, New Jersey. Lyle also maintains the Perth Amboy residence and may have been the silversmith for the Perth Amboy city seal. The architect for the proprietary house is John Edward Pryor. According to Pryor's account book, he borrows slaves in building the proprietary house. Enslaved workers provide the hard labor, such as digging foundations, leveling ground, setting cut stones, and hauling bricks. Royal Governor William Franklin has enslaved servants. William's personal valet is a black slave. And even Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. George, Jemima, and King are Benjamin's enslaved servants. Later in life, Benjamin becomes an abolitionist. And the abolishment of slavery is something most New Jersey colonists do not want to consider. During 1774, 81 angry Perth Amboy residents warned Governor William Franklin about the dismal consequences of abolition, including the possibility of a slave revolt if New Jersey's black population is not controlled. In part, the colonial capital of New Jersey is built by enslaved people. Many of the gentry term slavery as a peculiar institution. Not all Perth Amboy's gentry are pro-slavery. Thomas Bartow, sometimes called the Old Hermit, is the Surveyor General for the East Jersey proprietors and resides at the southwest corner of High and Market Streets. Bartow believes that blacks and Native Americans should not be enslaved. Bartow is also the teacher of a young William Dunlap. Dunlap will be among the first Perth Amboy slave owners to free his enslaved servants, setting a respected example for many more people to follow. Perth Amboy's William Dunlap is born in 1766. Dunlap will become a gifted artist, an art historian, and a playwright. The father of the American drama is the title given to Dunlap. Dunlap will also become an abolitionist. On February 15, 1804, the New Jersey legislature enacts a law entitled An Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery.
That every child born of a slave within this state, after the 4th day of July next, shall be free, but shall remain the servant of the owner of his or her mother, in the same manner as if such child had been bound to service, and shall continue in such service if a male until the age of 25 years, and if a female until the age of 21 years. Council and General Assembly, Trenton, New Jersey, 1804.
Therefore, New Jersey is technically no longer a slave state, but slaveholding remains. Like other northern states, New Jersey replaces slavery with involuntary servitude for a fixed number of years. This same law allows slave owners to free children in bondage by surrendering them to the county poorhouse. In turn, the county poorhouse returns these children to the same slaveholder.
That the person entitled to the service of any child may abandon such right, and such child shall be maintained at the expense of the state at a rate of $3 per month.
So many slaveholders opt for this subsidy that by 1809, 40% of the New Jersey state budget is consumed with paying it. In essence, New Jersey taxpayers pay slaveholders to keep their slaves. To make matters even worse, slaveholders have the option to sell their slaves to the Deep South, and a new 1818 law forbids this practice. After the American Revolution, the proprietary house serves as a personal home. Later owners of this mansion include John Rattoon and Matthias Brune. Both Brune and Rattoon are also slave owners. In his last will and testament, John Rattoon set forth conditions for freeing his slaves. During 1810, Matthias Bruin owns at least 3 slaves, but by 1830, Bruin has only 1. In the early 19th century, many dinners, balls, and parties are held within the proprietary house. Matthias Bruin is one of the wealthiest men in New Jersey. Dinner meetings are commonplace, with many New York City businessmen enjoying the splendor of this grand mansion. At one time, the Andrew Bell Homestead existed just south of the proprietary house. Like the Rattoons and Bruins, slaves also work this mansion. Daphne, an enslaved woman, is a servant here. Later, she will be set free with an inheritance and leave the Bell Mansion to start a life of her own. Local handyman Thomas Mundy Peterson marries Daphne, and they will purchase their own home in Perth Amboy. During 1818, Perth Amboy resident Lewis Compton, along with South River resident Jacob Van Wickle, make a devious scheme. To understand their plan, we need to know that the state of New Jersey had passed a law allowing the gradual abolition of slavery. That means the price of slaves in New Jersey decreased in value, as the institution of slavery was being dismantled in the Garden State. Compton and Van Wickle see a chance to make money. In the southern states, slave prices remain high. They can sell New Jersey slaves to the Deep South and make a large profit. A New Jersey slave can be purchased for $300, and that same slave can be sold in Louisiana for $800. One roadblock to this scheme is a New Jersey law requiring a slave's consent to leave the Garden State. But legal consent is determined by court judges. However, for Middlesex County Judge Jacob Van Wickle, that is not a problem. Slaves are deceived and coerced by Compton and Van Wickle. Judge Van Wickle even certifies children as young as 6 weeks old as consenting to leave New Jersey. The crying of a slave infant is deemed an answer of approval by Van Wickle. 2 ships are hired by Compton to transport slaves to Louisiana. Near Perth Amboy, the vessels the Mary Ann and the Thorn are loaded with 75 enslaved persons. Due to citizen complaints, the Mary Ann bypasses Perth Amboy officials and sails out of New York Harbor. The Perth Amboy-based Thorn meets up with the Mary Ann off the coast of Sandy Hook and transfers 36 enslaved people onto the Mary Ann. Several slaves are forced on board. At least one man is tied up and dragged below deck. By this time, the deception of consent has been revealed to all. The Thorn returns to Perth Amboy and loads yet another cargo of slaves on board, setting off for New Orleans. Authorities eventually catch up with the Mary Ann as the slave cargo is illegal. Yet, despite admissions of wrongdoing by those involved, no one is found guilty. And the people, who would have been freed via New Jersey law, now live out the rest of their lives in Southern bondage, enslaved for life. Perth Amboy is located on a bluff, arising out of the junction of the Arthur Kill and Raritan River, which forms the Raritan Bay. These natural resources serve Perth Amboy well, providing fine oysters from the bay, along with a high-quality clay in the subsoil. During the 19th century, the harvesting of oysters and the making of bricks become the leading industries. Here on Water Street, the Parker Castle remains a witness to the many changes going on within Perth Amboy. The stone section of the Parker Castle was constructed during the 1720s, with the frame front being added before the American Revolution. Throughout the 1850s, the steamer Thomas Hunt brings in new residents with progressive ideas to this old city. One of those ideas is the freedom of slaves, with the means to do so via the Underground Railroad. Shrouded in legend and myth, the Underground Railroad is subject to more fabrication than any other slavery topic. First, the Underground Railroad is not underground, although some tunnels are used. It is not a railroad, even though some trains transport enslaved people. The Underground Railroad is a network used to guide runaway slaves to freedom, and Perth Amboy becomes part of that network. Marcus Spring is one of the founders of the Raritan Bay Union, located near the western border of Perth Amboy. A large 254-foot-long building called a phalanx is constructed on the bluff above the Raritan River. Within this phalanx is the Eagleswood School, along with apartments and service rooms for residents. Golden eagles nest here every year, which is where the name comes from. Eagleswood becomes a major station of the Underground Railroad. At this time, there is a national law named the Fugitive Slave Act. This 1850 act requires that runaway slaves be returned to their masters. There are monetary penalties, along with jail time for those aiding runaways. Both free and slave states are subject to the Fugitive Slave Act. During 1857, yet another blow to the anti-slavery movement occurs. It is one of the worst United States Supreme Court rulings of all time, the Dred Scott decision. Under this legal case, the Supreme Court rules that Scott is descended from slaves, thus not a United States citizen, and therefore cannot bring a lawsuit in a court of law. And the Supreme Court also decides that any ban on slavery is against the law because it violates property rights. Sadly, during 1857, slaves are considered property. Rational people, meaning those with more common sense, know that slaves are not property. They are only people being treated as property. Many believe that slavery should be abolished, so these abolitionists, utilizing the Underground Railroad, stand up for human rights and defy United States law, as well as the Supreme Court decision. Since they are operating in direct opposition to the law of the land, the Underground Railroad must operate in secrecy, with almost no records being kept.
Human beings may be inconsistent, but human nature is true to herself. She has uttered her testimony against slavery with a shriek ever since the monster was begotten. Until it perishes amidst the execrations of the universe, she will traverse the world on its track, dealing her bolts upon its head and dashing against it her condemning brand. Theodore Weld, 1839.
Weld is one of the leaders of the anti-slavery movement. Among Weld's peers is a young Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland, Douglass goes on to become a national leader of the abolition movement and one of the greatest orators of his day. This daguerreotype is a rare glimpse of a historic call to end slavery. It is taken at an 1850 rally opposing the Fugitive Slave Act. Within this primitive image are anti-slavery leaders: Gerrit Smith, Frederick Douglass, Theodore Weld, and Angelina Grimke. And this growing movement will soon take Weld and Grimke to a small town in New Jersey, a former slave port named Perth Amboy. In 1854, Theodore Weld, along with his wife Angelina Grimke, step onto a Raritan River wharf in western Perth Amboy. The place is called Eagleswood. Weld is hired by Eagleswood co-founder Marcus Spring to start a progressive school. A school that would treat both sexes and all races equally. This idea is appealing to both Weld and Grimke, and the concept is beyond exceptional for this day and time. Blacks and whites will be schooled together in the same classroom without any discrimination. Angelina invites her sister, Sarah Grimke, to become an Eagleswood teacher. By the mid-19th century, both Angelina and Sarah have developed a reputation as abolitionists and also as feminists. And beyond that, the Grimke sisters and Theodore Weld are secret agents of the Underground Railroad. Thus, by the end of 1854, the Underground Railroad becomes firmly established on the banks of the Raritan River in Old Perth Amboy.
The Underground Railroad station at Eagleswood was becoming an important hiding place. Rebecca Spring often supervised the care given runaways who sought shelter at Massa Springs, where they had been directed. Hideaways were honeycombed in cave-like spots in the oak groves. Beatrice Beauchart, granddaughter of Marcus and Rebecca Spring.
At Eagleswood, the Raritan River provides an excellent means to transport slaves. Runaways are brought up the steep bluff towards the phalanx. Here, the refugees are given safe haven. Wounds from their trek are treated. However, Eagleswood is not the end of the journey. Due to the Fugitive Slave Act, runaways need to be transported north to Canada. Bounty hunters comb the New Jersey countryside for runaway slaves, and any place in the United States remains unsafe. There are many places to hide runaways at Eagleswood. At a length of 254 feet, the phalanx provides many rooms and passageways. And the phalanx is not the only place, as there are 30 other structures at Eagleswood, the art studio being one of these. Photographer Matthew Brady took this rare image of the phalanx. This image is the only known photograph of Eagleswood during its heyday. In the foreground, an orchard and vineyard is evident. Directly in back of the phalanx is the Raritan River. In aiding runaway slaves, those involved in the Underground Railroad are not only making an effective protest against slavery, but they are also doing something far more tangible. They are helping the oppressed. Taking chances, along with defying unjust laws, are a daily activity for all involved. The year is 1855, and the place is the Camden Amboy Railroad ferry terminal in Philadelphia. An enslaved woman, along with her 2 children, are requesting freedom. Standing nearby is their slave master, who argues that they are his property. Unknown to the slaveholders that this place is a main route of the Underground Railroad. Conductors of the Underground Railroad are on the scene. They immediately come between the slave master and the woman, making a physical barrier. All 3 slaves, the woman and the 2 children, are escorted out of the Camden Amboy ferry terminal to freedom. guides of the Underground Railroad are sometimes called conductors. One of the most famous guides is Harriet Tubman, herself a former slave. Many of Tubman's travelers will go through Philadelphia. William Still is a conductor in Philadelphia. The city of brotherly love lives up to its name, being a main hub of the Underground Railroad. William Still will arrange safe transport across the Delaware River to the New Jersey side. On the Jersey side, other conductors, such as William's brother, Dr. James Still, or Thomas Oliver, will take over the journey. Here is a rare 19th century map showing routes of the Underground Railroad. From Camden, the runaways are transported to New Brunswick. Just east of New Brunswick, conductors are commonly met with opposition in attempts to cross the Raritan River. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, and spies linger around this crossing. In order to avoid them, the road to Perth Amboy is used, and the Raritan River is also employed, as will take the refugees downstream, directly to the Eagleswood Dock in Perth Amboy. From Perth Amboy, stagecoaches, wagons, boats, and railroads are highly accessible for the northbound journey to Canada. In Perth Amboy, the sick and lame will be cared for and made fit for the trek. And so, the historic town of Perth Amboy works to redeem itself. This former slave port has now become a route to freedom. At 268 acres, Eagleswood comprises most of Perth Amboy's western border. Here, an old trail leads up to the Eagleswood Cemetery. Throughout the mid-19th century, philosophers, artists, authors, and runaway slaves used this route. This is a familiar scene to such people as Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louis Comfort Tiffany, and George Inness. One very special grave at the Eagleswood Cemetery is that of Arnold Buffum, founder of the New England Anti-Slavery Society.
My father, Arnold Buffum, passed the last years of his life at Eagleswood. Mobbed and stoned in America for being a friend of the black man, Arnold Buffum was the first president of the first Anti-Slavery Society, for which he suffered persecution. In America at that time, it was a disgrace to be an emancipationist. We, his children, were born to and live in that work, and we never rested from it, though we often had to pass through deep waters. Rebecca Buffum Spring, Eagleswood co-founder.
In 1859, at a mountain hideout, John Brown organizes a small army. Brown is under the firm belief that only a violent insurrection will overthrow the institution of slavery. On the evening of October 16th, Brown crosses the Potomac River, leading 18 men into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown and his small force descend into this town, seize the federal armory, free slaves, and vow to liberate every enslaved person in the South. Brown has high hopes that the local slave population will join him. This is not to be. A militia unit counterattacks Brown. Armed citizens outflank Brown. Brown, along with some of his men, take refuge in the armory's engine house and make it their fort. The firestorm from rifles and sidearms continues. One of Brown's lieutenants, Aaron Stevens, goes out under a flag of truce to negotiate a peace. Stevens is shot by a Harper's Ferry saloon keeper. Riddled by 6 bullets, Stevens collapses to the ground. Of the 18 men Brown led into Harper's Ferry, half are now dead, dying, or captured. United States Marines arrive at Harper's Ferry. They continue the attack, wounding and killing more Brown's men. After 2 days of fighting, Brown refuses to surrender. The Marines charge the engine house. Brown is taken prisoner along with other survivors. Newspapers across the country cover Brown's saga. Reporters flock to Brown's jail and courtroom trial in Charlestown, Virginia.
Startling news came to us one morning in October 1859 that men attempting to free the slaves at Harper's Ferry in Virginia were wounded and cast into prison. I said I must go help them. Mr. Spring entreated me not to think of it. He said the way was full of dangers and I could never get there. I answered, "We have talked against slavery all these years. Now somebody has done something. These men have risked their lives. I must go." Rebecca Buffum Spring, Eagleswood, Perth Amboy, New Jersey.
Rebecca travels with her son Edward to the Charlestown, Virginia jail, where John Brown and his lieutenant Aaron Stevens are held. Only by an order from a court of law do Rebecca and Edward gain access to Brown and Stevens. Both men are still bleeding from their wounds. Edward draws this rare image of Brown's prison room. In addition, Edward also draws a detailed plan of the Charlestown jail, showing windows and doorways. Some historians speculate that Edward may have been asked to do this by those planning to break Brown out of jail. There is no other explanation for such precise layouts. However, Brown is resolving to be executed as a martyr.
Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by the wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done. John Brown, Charleston Jail, 1859.
Rebecca Spring befriends two of Brown's imprisoned men, Aaron Stevens and Absalom Hazlitt.
Hazlitt was only 22 years old, but showed wonderful courage and trust. When all hope of mercy was over, he wrote to ask me to have him buried with Mr. Stevens in a free land. Rebecca Buffum Spring.
Rebecca and Edward Spring return to Perth Amboy. En route, they visit Mary Brown, John Brown's wife. Along with Mary's two daughters, they all travel to Eagleswood. The Brown family resides in the Spring Homestead near the Raritan River. On December 2nd, 1859, John Brown is executed on charges of treason, murder, and insurrection. 3 months later, both Stevens and Hazlitt are also paraded to the gallows. Marcus and Rebecca Spring have the bodies of Stevens and Hazlitt transported to Perth Amboy. One man offers $50 to have their coffins thrown into the Raritan River. Despite this threat, a memorial service takes place.
There was a great gathering at the funeral. The parlor, the hall, and the piazzas were all full of people. The hymns, the sermon, the words of several gentlemen, also what I said, were all listened to with respectful attention. And when I showed them a noble picture taken in prison of the young man Stevens, all hearts were touched, and I thought I saw tears in the eyes of even the man who had offered $50 to have their bodies thrown in the water. A long procession followed them to the final resting place, under the trees, in the beautiful cemetery at Eagleswood. Rebecca Buffum Spring, Perth Amboy, 1860.
At this cemetery, Stevens and Hazlitt are buried near the graves of runaway slaves and other deceased members of Eagleswood. With numerous pathways and hiding places along 268 acres of land, Eagleswood will continue to be a major station of the Underground Railroad. perhaps this being the greatest tribute to both free and enslaved people laid to rest within the Eagleswood Cemetery. The year 1861 brings change to Eagleswood. For the past 7 years, the Phalanx was a progressive educational institution, as well as an important station of the Underground Railroad. The outbreak of the American Civil War changes all that. Runaway slaves can now proceed directly to the Union Army. The Army takes in these runaways, calling them contrabands of war. This effectively ends the need for the secret Underground Railroad network. By mid-1861, Theodore Weld, along with the Grimke sisters, decide to leave Eagleswood. Weld returns to the lecture platform to speak on the plight of enslaved people. Marcus and Rebecca Spring agree with Weld. In order to serve the needs of the Union, the Springs convert the school into a military academy.
The real object of military discipline in the academy is not to make soldiers only of the students, but to give them the strength of body, vigor of constitution, and manliness of bearing, to fit them not merely for the field of battle, but all employments and departments of life. Marcus Spring, Perth Amboy, 1861.
In many Civil War battles, soldiers advance in large, tight formations towards well-fortified enemy positions. The military theory is that while advancing in tight ranks, the soldiers can deliver overwhelming concentrated firepower. These assaults result in a high casualty rate as the soldiers are exposed due to the tactics being employed. Over 600,000 soldiers die in the American Civil War. During September of 1862, President Abraham Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. Effective on the first day of 1863, this proclamation frees enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States. Lincoln turns the Civil War into a moral cause.
I am well satisfied if I can do anything to help carry out what I think is the greatest work of the moment, raising colored troops. The Emancipation Proclamation can only be made irrevocable by the bravery and blood of this downtrodden race. James McKay, Eagleswood Resident and Lieutenant, 4th Regiment, United States Colored Troops, 1863.
By 1865, the Civil War is winding down. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is only an executive order via wartime powers of the president. This emancipation order does not have the weight of law behind it. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation does not ensure the end of slavery. Lincoln presses the House of Representatives to pass a new amendment to the United States Constitution. Already passed in the Senate, the proposed 13th Amendment will free all slaves. On January 31, 1865, the House of Representatives passes the 13th Amendment, and within the same year it is ratified. Slavery is now outlawed. nearly 4 million enslaved people become free. Five days after General Robert E. Lee's Appomattox surrender, President Lincoln attends a play with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. With a single-shot .44 caliber pocket Derringer, John Wilkes Booth fires into the president. 9 hours later, Lincoln dies. The nation mourns the death of President Lincoln. The newfound freedom for black men and women will not be accepted by all Americans. Unfortunately, it will be met with intimidation, violence, and discrimination in many towns throughout the United States. On March 31st, 1870, a Perth Amboy election is held with the voting polls at City Hall. At question is the ratification of a revised city charter. However, what actually happens that day sets a national precedent.
I was working for Mr. J.L. Carney on the morning of the day and did not think of voting till he came out of the stable where I was attending to the horses and advised me to go to the polls and exercise a citizen's privilege. When I went home to dinner at noon, I met Mr. Marcus Spring of Eagleswood, a place about a mile off town, and he too advised me to claim the right of suffrage at the polls. As I advanced to the polls, one man offered me a ticket bearing the words Revised Charter, and another one marked No Charter. I thought I would not vote to give up our charter after holding it so long, so I chose a Revised Charter ballot. Thomas Mundy Peterson, Perth Amboy, 1870.
Just the day before this historic vote takes place, the 15th Amendment was adopted, becoming part of the United States Constitution. This amendment allows black men to vote. Thomas Mundy Peterson is the first black man to vote under this new law, with the second being Marcus Curlis, a coachman from Eagleswood. Peterson is requested to vote by Marcus Spring and James Lawrence Carney of the Carney Cottage. Carney is descended from Perth Amboy slaveholders. However, Carney is also an Eagleswood Academy alumni. He believes in racial equality. Thomas Mundy Peterson resides towards the back of the old Hugh Ramsay mansion at the corner of High and Commerce Streets on a small alleyway named Commerce Lane. In the background of this old photograph of Ramsay's residence may be the only known image of the Thomas Mundy Peterson homestead. Vertical clapboards accent what appears to be a front gable, board and batten-clad house. Throughout the 19th century, and even up to the present day, minorities are discouraged from voting. In some parts of the United States, roadblocks are put in place in order to disenfranchise these voters. Perth Amboy is different. While many places are trying to stop black Americans from voting, the citizens of Perth Amboy encourage the right to vote. Freedom is not free. American history serves as good evidence that freedom for all is a continuous struggle from one generation to the next. Issues with American slavery span 3 centuries, starting with a few colonial visionaries, expanding to an organized underground network, and eventually ending in a massive civil war. American slavery finally ceases to exist. Historic Perth Amboy's role in the slave trade is notorious, but over time the mindset changes in Perth Amboy. Citizens stand up for an ideal to improve the lot of the enslaved. strike out against the injustice of slavery, and in part set the trend for what America is about to become. With a firm belief that our country was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, the good people of Perth Amboy transformed their hometown from a port of slavery into a port of freedom.